Well, hello and welcome to, week 11 of our Bible in a year. You're doing really well. We've gone through some pretty tough stuff, which is what you often have to do when you start a project like this. So we are this week going to be looking at the end of Numbers, so chapters 23 through to 36. And there's some really interesting stuff in here. If you're a fan of narrative, because we haven't had a huge amount of narrative all the time, then the story of Balaam and Balak is continued. We just touched upon this last time, but this time we see that story through to the conclusion. You'll remember that Balaam, you can't say that without sounding like a sheep, can you? Balaam is a sorcerer, and he is summoned by the king, Balak. He's king of the Moabites, and he wants him to prophesy and to curse against the Israelites. But God comes to him and says, "Don't think you want to be doing that," and that plays out there. Then we'll recap through the festivals, which is a bit of a repetition from what we've done already. Then it talks about some of the stages in Israel's journey. And then we get to the end of that and we turn over the page to Deuteronomy, and you'll see there's a theme developing here, because in Deuteronomy, we are just going to be looking at chapters 1 to 4. Now, Deuteronomy, you could imagine as a really big sandwich with a lot of filling and a little bit of bread, because the first 4 chapters and the last 4 chapters are distinct discourses, to put it slightly technically. And then the middle bit, which is chapter 5 all the way through to chapter 26, is in effect the whole body of the work. So 1 to 4, which is what we're reading this week, really goes over the chief events of the last 40 years, talking about the 40 years in the wilderness, and with all the exhortations to obey what God has told the people to do, and warnings against the danger of turning your back on God. And it's funny you should say that, because actually the very last bit that we're doing this week is also about addressing issues around the wilderness, because we're looking at Hebrews chapters 1 to 5. And despite being called Hebrews, this is a New Testament book. We don't really know who wrote it. It could be Paul. And often when I've been preaching, I've said Paul almost as a default, because most of the letters are. Could be Barabbas, though, or Apollos. We don't really know. But it was somebody who had some kind of relationship with the apostles, who in turn had a relationship with Jesus. As you will not be surprised at the fact that it's called the letter to the Hebrews. We don't really know geographically where it went, but it seems to be to Jewish Christians, people with a real knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures and the stories that we've just been reading in Numbers and Deuteronomy and so on. So right back to Genesis with Abraham and the nation of Israel, and then you've got Mount Sinai and Moses there, and then you've got the giving of the law, you've got all the priests and the sacrifices, which we've been reading through, and then that wilderness wandering on their way to the promised land. And so what we have here is the first bit is all about sections, different bits and pieces. And what they're doing is 2 things. They are talking about how Jesus is better than a certain number of things and aspects of the Old Testament, and how you should stick with Jesus even in the midst of persecution, because these guys were being persecuted. They were being imprisoned for their faith. And so chapters 1 and 2, where we start, it's going to be about the fact that Jesus is better than the angels. He's far superior to the angels. He's far superior to the law, or the Torah, those first 5 books of the Old Testament that we've been reading through so far. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that Jesus is far superior to Moses in chapter 3, and in chapter 4 he's far superior, in terms of that journey to the promised land. There's a better promised land that Jesus brings. And then chapters 5 and 7, and you've only got to do 5 this week, is talking about the fact that Jesus is better than the priests and better than Melchizedek, who was one of those priests. He's given us an example of the priest. So you can see there's a theme here, isn't there? The theme is the wilderness. You may feel with some of these readings, because they are tough, and we'll need to be self-controlled and disciplined and dogged in reading some of these things, but we are coming through to the other side. If, like me, you prefer narrative to lists of instructions, then you're in for some real treats in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, there are glimpses of that and recapping the story, and particularly that stuff in Hebrews, which brings Jesus much more into focus in our Bible reading. And these are the ways that Jesus is better than those other days. You may remember reading through some of the stuff and the mess of sacrifice in worship. And I remember as I read those things thinking, I am glad as a church minister, I don't have to get so covered in blood as those guys did every day, more than once a day. But that's for later on in Hebrews. That's something that somebody else will talk about, Gregory, next week in this. So keep going, you're doing really well. We are getting on for a quarter of the way through the Bible. We're getting there, aren't we? 14th. This will take us to the 21st of March. We're going to do this. So just to recap, we are looking at Numbers 23 to 36, Deuteronomy 1 to 4, and Hebrews 1 to 5. Keep going and talk about it again for those of you that are in the discussions on Sunday. Look forward to it. Take care.